Hey. Right, I know a lot of you don't like this type of video, but I've also noticed that there's a growing number of you that do. In fact, I've had one or two people complain lately that they came to this channel for the political content and they're fed up of seeing motorcycles. Now, I sort of ummed and ahed over making this video. I thought about making it last week, but what I tried to do is just bring, if you like, political news to you that affects you as a motorist. I tried to keep it sort of specific to the normal channel content. And with the best will in the world, I was struggling to make this subject fit. But of all the crackpot net zero measures we've seen sort of put into force in the past, this new energy bill, which hopefully you've already heard about, is the most dystopian piece of proposed legislation I ever thought I would bear witness to in my lifetime. It's an astonishing piece of government overreach in the name of net zero. And I had to think about it. You know, as far as I'm aware, every motorcyclist in the UK, or non-motorcyclist in the UK, that watches this channel lives somewhere. I accept that not all of you will be homeowners. But those of you that are, have bought a house, they've paid through the nose for a mortgage their entire lives, with the intention of having some security when you get older. You know, when you reach old age. Because when it reaches that point in life where you're just living off a pension, you don't want to be spending a lot of that pension on rent. Net zero is an anti-human policy that's been brought in by a lot of countries, but more notably we're talking here about the UK. It was part of the current government's manifesto, and yes, those of us that voted for the current government voted for it, but it was one tiny part of a massive 50-page manifesto, and there were no explanations as to how we're going to go about achieving net zero. It lacked specifics, and I think if those specifics had been presented to most people, they wouldn't have voted for it. And net zero has become a crackpot policy that was doomed to failure from the start. In fact, it's currently falling apart at the seams. The sale of new internal combustion engine motor vehicles, including small motorcycles, is banned from 2030, and the only option that you'll have open to you from then, if you want to buy a new vehicle, is to buy an electric car. But electric cars are a lot more expensive than, you know, an internal combustion equivalent. They have a very limited range, and resale values are dropping through the floor because batteries don't last forever, and when you need to replace them, they cost more than the car's worth. And because of that, EV sales are stalling. Now, as I reported a few months ago, you know, the British government's looked at this situation and they've decided that the way to go forward is to put a cap on the amount of internal combustion engine vehicles that can be sold between now and 2030. Going forward, next year, 22% of all vehicles sold must be electric vehicles. And if individual manufacturers don't reach that target and they sell too many internal combustion engine vehicles, they'll be fined £15,000 per car that they oversell and £18,000 for every van or light goods vehicle that they oversell. The EV plan isn't working, so they're forcing it to work. Now, it doesn't end there. They're going to increase this percentage each year. So year on year, up to 2030, it's going to be becoming increasingly more difficult to buy an internal combustion engine vehicle, to the point where prospective customers will have to go onto a waiting list for a car that'll probably never be made available to them. Now, the UK government and the devolved UK governments have made it clear that going forward they don't want us to have motorised personal transport. This is all part of that plan. Because to achieve net zero, to get everything how they want it, they need to be able to stop people from travelling around. They need to keep them in one small area. Now, the way the structure of our society has evolved over the last 40 or 50 years, that's not achievable. 80 to 90% of the population need to be able to travel fairly long distances to get to work, to get to the doctors, to get to the hospital, or even just to get to the supermarket to buy food. So to make this whole net zero thing work, really, what they need to do is gain control over where we live and what we're living in. And this energy bill is the key to unlocking their ability to do that. Now, this energy bill has just been through its third reading. The next step is that it needs to go through the House of Lords, where hopefully it will stop. Now, originally it was called the Energy Security Bill, and I think it started about 14 months ago. Under Boris Johnson, of course, we've seen two new Prime Ministers since then. One that was elected, and one, Rishi Sanak, who was simply installed. Now, this energy bill went through a bit of a metamorphosis. The original idea behind it was to safeguard security of energy for the UK and to get us out of this rather messy situation that we have in this country where we're dependent on other countries for the most part for the supply of our energy needs. But as time went on, the security part of the title of this bill was dropped. It became known simply as the Energy Bill, and it grew a multitude of new heads. Now, I think calling it the Energy Bill was intentional. This is just my opinion, but I think it was intentional because if you try to research Energy Bill on the internet, all you get are hundreds or thousands of results telling you how to minimise your domestic energy bill or what to do if you can't pay your domestic energy bill. This rather insidious piece of proposed legislation just gets lost like a needle in the haystack. And I personally can't help feeling that they've done that intentionally to sort of quell public awareness of what's going on. After all, if you make it difficult to find, fewer people are going to know about it. To all intents and purposes, they've already taken away our cars and our motorcycles. We just haven't realised it yet. But looking at Clause 248 of this energy bill, I think the next step is to take away property. Now, the cunning thing about this legislation is, for the moment, they've not disclosed where the goalposts are. A bit like the manifesto for net zero. What they're doing is they're putting in place what's known as a statutory instrument. This is an overreaching piece of legislation which allows the government at a moment's notice to create new criminal laws ad hoc as they see fit with minimum or no public scrutiny via a sort of a fast-track rubber stamping regime. Now, clearly in the future they're going to set certain goals. They're not telling us what those goals are yet, but they're going to set certain goals that properties have to adhere to in relation to carbon emissions and usage of energy. And this statutory instrument will allow them to create a criminal offence for not meeting those targets which they've not currently set, so we don't know what they are. And in any case, when they do set them, as we've already seen with this government, after a period of time they will tighten them up, and then they will tighten them up again. And they'll continue to tighten them up until they've got a stranglehold on everybody. Now, these criminal offences pertain specifically to failing to meet the standards set by the government and obstructing a government official, we don't know who they are going to be yet, from checking the green credentials of your property, or giving false information as to the green credentials of your property. Yes, you heard that right, a 12-month custodial sentence in prison for failing to meet net zero. Now, on top of that, there's also a potential fine of £15,000 for failing to bring your dwelling or your business premises up to the specific code currently required by the government. Now, this is going to make life for businesses, specifically small businesses, very difficult. It's also going to make life very difficult for landlords that rent out residential property. But it's also going to impact homeowners like me and you. The UK is full of old properties that, with the best will in the world, will probably never be able to adapt to this new regime of net zero measures. And even if they can be brought up to these new codes, it's going to be incredibly expensive. Now, the property I live in is 60 years old. It's double brick construction. It's a cold house. It takes some heating. I don't know whether it's really going to be possible to bring my home up to the spec that the government is yet to announce. For a start, we don't know what it's going to be. But I know if it can be done, it's going to cost tens of thousands of pounds. Something most people don't have at the moment. We're in a cost of living crisis. I had cavity wall insulation installed about 20 years ago, as well as loft insulation. I've got no doubt that neither of those products that were put in will probably meet the current codes that the government will be looking for. The windows are double glazed, but they're 30 years old. They're showing their age now, and I'm sure, once again, they're not going to meet the codes that the government will be looking for. After World War II, the entire country went on a mass building programme to, replace housing that had been destroyed during the war, as well as to cater for an ever-growing population. And I dare say that most houses built 30 years ago or more are probably not going to meet these new codes. And if they can be brought up to the code, is the average house owner going to be in a position to afford it? I had a new heating system put in 6 or 7 years ago. A lot of things have changed since then. Is my new current heating system going to meet the specs? Is it going to comply with the codes? Now, it's not just me. Millions of householders are going to be faced with this question over the next few years if this legislation goes through. And I believe that potentially this legislation is a Trojan horse that potentially leaves us all wide open to a massive property grab. I'll explain why. Now, one thing I quickly want to say is a government spokesman recently said that the government has no intention of creating new criminal laws in conjunction with this subject. If that's the case, why haven't they taken Clause 248 out of the bill? If they're telling the truth, there's no reason for that still to be there. Now, scenario number one, if you can't get your house up to the emissions codes that the government stipulate, either because it's not possible or because you can't afford it, the first option they have is to slap you with a £15,000 fine, which you're probably not going to be able to afford either. And even if you do manage to scrape that fine together, you're still left with the problem where your home doesn't comply. So you're back to square one. It's a catch-22 situation. Now, as I've said, we still don't know where the goalposts are for this, but I think it's quite plausible that in a situation where you can't get a home up to specification because it's not possible or economically viable, that property may well be condemned as uninhabitable because it doesn't meet the net zero regulations. Now, that might seem like a bit of a reach on my part, but what else can they do? If your property does not and cannot meet the regulations, what happens? They're not just going to let it slide. That property will have to be taken out of circulation. Now, I don't know if you're aware of it, but most county councils do have the power to seize properties that are deemed as uninhabitable. And that power is ancient. It's been around for decades. Now, granted, it's not something that they can do just overnight. It can take years for the process to go through. But ultimately, they can take possession of your property, whether through payment or otherwise, and either knock it down and build compliant property on that land, or sell it on at a healthy profit to a property developer to build compliant properties on it. Now, the other route is that, according to the laws of this land, if you are a debtor and you owe more than £1,000 to any entity that you can't or won't pay, they can apply to the court for a sort of possession order which will force the sale of that property so they can get that £1,000 or more back. So that's another route that they can go down if you can't afford to pay your £15,000 fine. Either way, there's the potential there for you to completely lose your home with little or no compensation. Of course, you will then be homeless and you'll have to rent property. Now, the other scenario, of course, is a custodial sentence. If you're charged with the offence of failing to comply or obstructing or lying to an official because you can't afford to get your house up to code, you could potentially be put away for 12 months, which essentially is going to put you in the same situation. If you're serving porridge for a year, you can't work, you can't earn money, you can't pay your mortgage, you can't get your house up to spec, you're in exactly the same position where potentially that house can be taken away from you. Now, it is just my opinion, but it seems to me that, certainly this section of the energy bill is intended to compromise house ownership, whether it be for an owner-occupier or a landlord that, makes a living by renting out several older properties. My personal opinion is that this new energy bill is an instrument designed to transfer property ownership over to the elite so they can realise this 15-minute city dream. Once this legislation's put in place, everything is there that they need. As we know, Rishi Sanak is a very wealthy man, as well as being the current Prime Minister of this country. He's got the power to dial back on these draconian measures that we're currently seeing being put in front of us one by one. Now, I've been told that Rishi owns a total of 14 residences. Now, the only ones that I'm aware of is a £6.6 million house in London, a house in California, and a £2 million home in Northallerton, North Yorkshire, which has been in the news a few times over the last year. As far as net zero is concerned, Rishi isn't really leading by example, is he? He uses his Northallerton home as a weekend getaway. And last year, during a drought and a water shortage, he was criticised for installing a private swimming pool and gym complex. A private swimming pool that is reputed to cost, and this is going back to last year's energy prices, £14,000 a year just to heat. And it's just his weekend getaway that he stays at most weekends. Ethically, how does that fit in with net zero? The government can't afford net zero, it's unattainable and unmanageable financially, so they're pushing the cost onto us, Joe Public. This is all at our expense. They're not offering any incentives. It's blackmail. They're threatening us. If you don't do this, you'll go to prison. If you don't do that, we'll fine you £15,000. With a very real but as yet unspoken threat that if you can't comply and you can't pay, we'll take it away. You see, Mr. Sunak, like a lot of politicians, doesn't live in the real world. He doesn't realise the optics of his royalty-like lifestyle compared to the hand-to-mouth existence that most of the great unwashed have to endure. He doesn't understand the concept of leading by example. And if I'm honest, I don't think he really cares. He's already got your car and your motorcycle, it's just that we're still living in that limbo period where it hasn't quite registered with you yet. And now he's coming for your home. I've been branded as a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist several times over the last 3 years while I've been making these sort of videos. Yet, one by one, pretty much everything I've predicted has happened. I've thought about this a lot in recent weeks because I've been aware of this bill for a long time. I can't see this ending any other way. We've witnessed more civil unrest in this country than I ever remember, what with low traffic neighbourhoods and ULEZ. This country is not happy with Mr. Sunak and what he's doing. Yesterday, while I was researching this video, I found a petition to the government for a referendum on net zero. Mr. Sunak's already stated categorically that he won't tolerate a referendum on net zero. Because let's face it, the last thing he wants is for net zero to run into democracy. It's been up for some time and it's only had 1,700 signatures. Mine is now among them. Lend some weight behind it. You know, it takes 5 minutes of your time to fill it out and register your signature. Share it with your friends and your family, because do you know what? I think this country needs a debate on whether it really should be thrown headlong into this net zero dream. I'll leave a link to it in the video description. A recent poll suggests that net zero isn't popular in the UK anymore, with only 16% of the country's population approving of it. The government is hell-bent on just stuffing this agenda down our throats, and yeah, I hear people all the time saying, well, you know, we can't do anything about it, they won't listen to us, there's no point signing a petition, there's no point writing to my MP, peaceful demonstrations are just ignored. Maybe you're right, maybe we can't stop it, but not doing anything about it certainly isn't going to stop it. Right, once again, thanks for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. If you care about, you know, net zero and the way it's going to affect not just your life, but your children, your children's children, their children, because it is going to have a profound impact on their lives in the future, do something. Find an organisation that, you know, you trust. Put your weight behind them. Fill a petition out. It's just a few minutes of your time. And share this video with as many people as you feel comfortable sharing it with, because if people don't know about it, they're not going to find out about it until it's too late. And don't just share this video, find other similar videos from content creators that you trust and share them. Get the word out. It's not game over yet, not quite. Right, I will of course be back on Friday, so until then, please ride safely, think about what I've said, and I'll see you soon.